So the format is going to be that I'm just going to introduce the speakers, and then each of the speakers will speak for 15 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions and answers. Could I ask you kindly to close your cell phones, Blackberries, because I'm told it interferes with the live webcast, and we have a large audience watching it on the live webcast. Thank you for your consideration. As all of you know, Prime Minister Erdogan has been Prime Minister of Turkey since 2003, and during his tenure, the Turkish economy has been expanding, and the government has wielded a lot of influence in the region. Turkey became, or could have been, a role model for the countries of the Arab Spring. I recall hosting here Rashid Ghannouchi, the head of the Nahda party from Tunisia, and when I asked him, so half jokingly, whether they were moving towards an Iranian example, he looked at me as if he was very offended and said, if there is going to be an example, it's going to be the Turkish model for Tunisia. But then, as you know, there was a downturn, demonstrations last summer, then trials, long sentences, corruption cases, cabinet reshuffle, suspension of judges, prosecutors, and firing of police officers. And even the Prime Minister accused all these to a foreign plot. Of course, on top of all this, there is the Fethullah Gulen affair. To help us understand what is really going on in Turkey, we have invited two top experts in the field, Professors Henri Barki and Ehsan Daghi. To my left, Henri Barki is a former public policy fellow at the Wilson Center, and he's the department chair and Cohen Professor of International Relations at Lehigh University, and his most recent works include Iraq, its neighbors, and the United States, co-edited with Phoebe Moore and Scott Lozinski, and also spin-off, The Syrian Crisis and the Future of Iraq in American Interest. His recent two articles, we have published them, and they are outside. You can take them with you. Professor Daghi, to my right, is Professor of International Relations at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara. He regularly writes for Turkish daily and Zaman and Today's Zaman. From 2007 to 2013, he served as the editor-in-chief of a quarterly Inside Turkey. He is currently a Fulbright visiting fellow at the School of Advanced and International Studies, and this is the first time he is at the Wilson Center, and we hope this is going to be the beginning of many times when we will invite you to come back to the center. Henri, you have
Thank you, Hale, and it's nice to be back at the Wilson Center. Ihsan and I, we've been trying to figure out what it is we're going to say and what kind of answers we're going to give you, but then we realized that we actually have no answers. So if you want to leave now, this is the time. This is clearly an amazingly complex situation. So what I would like to do is essentially make 4 general points, and again, as Ihsan and I decided that it will be much more fun to answer questions that people have rather than for us to say there's so much going on, there's so many details that there's no way we can do justice to it. All right. First of all, I mean, the current crisis that Hale also mentioned in terms of the corruption scandal, the accusations of plots, etc., is really a crisis of confidence. It's a two-edged crisis of confidence. It's a crisis of confidence on the part of the AKP, Erdogan, about itself. 11 years after coming to power, you realize that they still, having achieved what they have, whether it's economically or politically, it is still a very fragile, a very unsure political party and leader who, at the onset of this crisis, immediately decided that there was a plot against it. But it tells you a little bit about how the party itself and the government thinks about itself. The second crisis of confidence, and in some ways you can argue will have much longer repercussions for Turkey, is the external crisis of confidence. And that is how the world perceives Turkey, how the world perceives the AKP government, the Turkish economy, and where Turkey goes from here. In terms of the external repercussions, and I'll come back to that at the end again, we already have seen a decline in the Turkish lira, which, by the way, is not necessarily all that bad in that the Turkish lira was overvalued, but fundamentally there's been a major exit of hot money, as people say, which have been used to finance the external trade deficit, the current account balance deficit, and in general, what does this crisis mean in terms of foreign investors who invest in Turkey, who need, and the Turkish government obviously needs them in terms of the grand projects it has, in terms of financing, etc. Domestically, to go back to the repercussions in the domestic issue, is that you have a fight now about institutions. And it seems to me, at least, that no one is sure about the institutions themselves. You have these accusations that there's a parallel government a parallel state within the state, the Gülen movement, coup plots. But what is important to understand here is that when you talk about lawyers, prosecutors, judges, Turkey has certain institutions. They may not be perfect, but those institutions have also, in a certain esprit de corps, have a certain way of doing things. What I don't understand and what is that this onslaught on the police, on the prosecutors, what kind of damage it will also do to Turkey down the road. Because I will just, if you are a prosecutor, if you are a judge, you do have a certain corporate loyalty. You are first and foremost a judge, you're first and foremost a prosecutor, and people don't necessarily take kindly to being accused or to be pushed around the way the government is doing. And what the government hasn't done is to learn from its lessons, from the lessons that it should have done in the past. If you remember, some years ago, there was a prosecutor in the town of Şemdinli in the Kurdish areas who decided to question the chief of staff of the military. This was, I think, was in 2006, 2007. And immediately, the chief of staff arranged for this prosecutor to be removed from his position in the southeast, kicked out of the prosecutorial service, and then they took away his license to be a lawyer. I believe that part of the reason why the prosecutors and the judges were so hard on the Turkish military had to do with the fact that they really resented the fact that a prosecutor was terribly handled by the military for essentially doing his job. And what I'm trying to say is that this is my hypothesis, but we don't know many of the facts. But I suspect the same thing is going to happen also in Turkey. All right. So the first point is that this is a crisis of confidence that's affecting all the institutions, and we have a war at the moment between institutions. Whether or not the Gülen movement is behind all of this, there's no way we can know about this. I mean, I think to say that the whole prosecutorial service, the whole police is controlled by one man sitting in some farm in Pennsylvania sounds a little bit ludicrous to me. But I'll come back to this in the question and answer period. Second point is that this is only the beginning of the crisis. It is the beginning of the crisis because, A, we don't know much about the corruption scandal. We know about the first 3 ministers who had to resign. We know about the change in the government. We know about the fourth minister. We know that the prosecutors have formulated a complaint that went to the parliament regarding these 4 ministers. Whether or not this is Parliament is going to do anything about it remains to be seen, given the fact that the AKP controls the Parliament completely. But there's something going on here in the sense that you can't look at the current crisis in isolation. You have to look at that in conjunction with the Gezi protests of May and June of earlier this year. What happened then was really unhinged the Turkish government and Erdogan in particular. Crisis management was terribly poor at the time of the Gezi protests. And again, at the time, you saw the repercussions, again, people claiming there was a plot. It was foreign plot, it was the interest rate lobby, it was foreign powers, it was Lufthansa, you name it. But had this corruption case emerged in the absence of Gezi, it is possible that the Turkish government's reaction would have been A, maybe different, B, it would have been able to handle it differently, but because it came after Gezi, because it was unhinged by what happened in Gezi, this is really became very serious. And what the government has had to do is essentially double down. In Gezi, they brought up the question of the plots. Now it's again the plots, but they have amplified the nature of or the size, the nature of the plot, so much so that it is now very, very difficult for the government to essentially go back on this. And the problem is also, in terms of the public, is that there is no one you can trust anymore. The press is completely compromised. Essentially, you can argue that the Turkish press has never been very truthful, has always made up stories. But now more than ever, all we have to do is essentially watch some of the television stations and read the newspapers. So you don't have any mediating institutions at the moment. So if you're looking at it from the perspective of an individual citizen in Turkey, you see the government, you see accusations against the Gülen movement, you see accusations against judges and prosecutors, against police. Police are being moved. The press is all over the place, and every day new revelations come out and new fantasies are created. So where do you stand on all of this? So and the civil society in Turkey has essentially remained completely on the sidelines because it cannot react to this. So in some ways, I think this is only the beginning of the crisis. It's actually going to get worse. And this is also, it has to do essentially, my third point is what is the government trying to achieve? What is Erdogan's goal here? Hey, I can't get into his brain. I don't know what he's thinking. But it seems to me that for him, the most important thing are the municipal elections. The municipal elections is going to be obviously the first test. I think Erdogan is ready to see his percentage of the vote decline, let's say, from last time there was elections, which was almost 50%, to 46 or 47%. I mean, that's acceptable to him. But anything below that essentially will invalidate his argument about, I have 50% of the public behind me. 42%, which is what, by the way, one of the polling organizations came up with yesterday as what the likely voters how they would vote. 42%, I'm sorry, is not acceptable to him. So the whole strategy now is to essentially consolidate the support base. And in a way, I think the AKP is has decided that after Gezi, when they talked about all these foreign plots, etc., their own polling showed that they had managed to consolidate their support base and that they did not lose a lot. So that also explains why the plots are being are being brought up again as a way of defending themselves. But what happens if he doesn't get 46, 47%? And I think that's also another reason why this crisis is going to continue, because if he doesn't, and especially if he loses one of the big cities, Ankara or Istanbul, to the opposition, which is a possibility, not necessarily a huge possibility, but nonetheless, we don't know how this is going to go on, then you will find that the opposition is going to feel itself emboldened. There will be many more cracks maybe within the AKP. And the fight between the AKP and the rest of the opposition is going to be much bloodier in some ways and much more combative. Finally, my fourth point is the external dimensions. And here we should not underestimate the impact this is having on whether it is the White House perception or the Chancellor of Germany's perception of Turkey, and especially of Erdogan. Look, after Gezi, yes, they talked about all these plots. And, Oscar Wilde famously once said, to lose one parent may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both sounds like carelessness. Once accusing people of a plot, you can say, this was an unusual circumstance, so you take your lumps if you're the foreign government and the foreign powers. But what is happening now is that not only this is you have a repeat of the accusations, but they've raised up the ante. I mean, for the first time, the American ambassador was 4 newspapers one day basically came out saying he should be kicked out on a completely fictitious conversation that he had with some EU diplomats. So in terms of relation, by the way, other American diplomats were also accused. But if you watch, like I unfortunately end up doing too much of, watch Turkish television and read Turkish newspapers, I mean, you come away with this really very xenophobic, very anti-West, very anti-Semitic discourse that is non-stop. And the way you prove your loyalty to the government, to Erdogan especially, is by saying that there is a plot. So even people who should know better, take Babacan, the deputy prime minister in charge of the economy, the guy who has really worked miracles in many ways. The other day came out and said, this is a mini coup. I mean, I think this is his way of saying, well, I don't really believe it. It's a mini coup. I mean, he could have said it's a huge coup, but he said it's a mini coup. That's his way of resisting or showing resistance. But everybody, even yesterday, Davutoglu came out and talked about, not in very explicit terms, but still talked about plots against Turkey, etc. And this is going to make Turkish-American relations in particular very, very difficult. There's so much this White House will take. Already, President Obama, who used to confer with Prime Minister Erdogan on a regular basis, especially on issues like Syria, which are critical, they haven't spoken. Well, they spoke after Gezi, in many ways, to the president essentially wanted to tell Erdogan that he was going too far with these accusations, but there hasn't been any conversation since. Even when the United States was thinking of bombing Syria, you would have expected, given how Turkey borders Syria, there are American assets there, did not consult or talk to the Turkish Prime Minister, which is really, really unusual. And I expect that if these accusations continue, if something happens to any American diplomat or anybody else, because this is where I think you can see the xenophobia going, that there will be a really severe price to pay internationally. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Audrey. By the way, today's meeting is a joint program between the Global European Program and the Middle East Program at the Wilson Center, and I would like to thank the Global Europe Program to be very helpful to arrange this meeting. Now we turn to Professor Doug. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Hala. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here at Wilson Center, of course. I well, talking of Turkey, what it seems that democracy is still not the only game in town. The losers keep damning it, while the winners try to change the rules to ensure a perpetual win. It is somehow sad and disappointing. In my presentation, I will start with a broad description of what has happened so far concerning this corruption scandal, and then I will move on to look at how the government has responded to the Graph-Prot. And then, in the conclusion, I will try to understand and explain how the government reaction and the scandal itself have impacted on the prospect for democracy, human rights, rule of law, and separation of powers in Turkey. So briefly, what happened? In Turkey, events would always have its history. You'll have a very rich background to explain what turned out to be a beginning of an investigation on December the 17th. But if you start with December 17th, what happened was, I think, very clear. A public prosecutor revealed an investigation that charged some people close to the government with corruption, bribery, and money laundering. Those charges involved 3 ministers of the government and 2 sons of two ministers. At the center of the scandal was an Iranian origin businessman called Reza Zarrab. He was accused of money laundering and bribing Turkish officials, including 2 ministers. Upon the request of public prosecutor, the court decided to arrest 26 suspects, including the 2 sons of 2 ministers. That was the first wave. The second started on December 25th. Another public prosecutor revealed its investigation and ordered the police officers to arrest 41 people, most of them businessmen close to the government, and also brought the police officers to search places and arrest those, detain those suspects. The police did not comply by the rule of the court and the request of the public prosecutor. That was really interesting. Then public prosecutors engaged in the investigation were removed from their post, taken away from the file that they've been investigating. And that is what happened so far in terms of the corruption allegations. So it is in the court. Basically, it's in the court. The court also, by the way, frozen the assets of those 41 individuals as asked by public prosecutor. Their bank assets have been frozen, though the police officers did not comply by the request of the court and the public prosecutor. The government response. The government really did not see the case as a legal case, but as a political plot, as a political operation, aiming to topple the government, just like the government interpreted the Gezi protest in summer last year. So the way that the government read the corruption allegations was that it was an intentional plot to targeting the government. Not only targeting government, in fact, the way it was formulated was that it targeted Turkey. Turkey as a rising star in the region, Turkey that has increased its regional and global profile. The government argued has been targeted as a result of this operation attributed to international dark forces, as they said. Here, the AK Party's defense pointed to two factors. One, they underlined the timing of the graph prop. They said local elections are approaching, so these investigations cannot be independent of those forces who try to pull the government down in upcoming elections. So they regarded the timing as meaningful, as Turkey is in the process of three elections, first in March local elections, then in summer presidential elections, and the year after general election. So many in the government side regarded the timing of the graph probe as meaningful, designed to damage AK Party in the upcoming elections. But opponents of this view says that inquiry started more than a year before, and the public prosecutors took the step on December 17 because the investigation was about to be disclosed. Again, concerning the upcoming elections, well, there is always a forthcoming election in a democracy. Local elections, national parliamentary elections, presidential elections, by-elections. So they don't really take this election argument very seriously if we keep going to have elections in Turkey. And the second line of defense for the government is based on a particular reading of the actors involved. So the government side doesn't really show us the prosecutors, courts, investigations, etc. They tell us to look at who are in fact behind those who carry out investigation and bring the case to the court. Who are they? They identify those who are behind the graph probe as dark forces, international masterminders, the traitors, agents, collaborators of foreign powers like US, Israel, CIA, Mossad, everything. So it is extremely difficult, not difficult, impossible to verify who is really behind. If you start to looking at behind what appears, what is concrete, I mean, there is no end to this. So I think this argument is somehow self-defeating because in this way, the AK Party asks us to fight against the phantoms while there are evidences of corruption encircling the government and the members of the government. So this is, I think, a weak point of defense on the part of the government. Another response, apart from developing this argumentation against the corruption scandal, another step the government took was take some measures within administration that appeared attempting to stop the investigation. That created really question marks. because there are evidence produced by public prosecutors and revealed to public. Tape records, conversations, video clips, financial transactions, found money. Instead of looking at what appeared, what is there visible, the government chose to fight against the whole idea of corruption being brought to the justice. So that line was, I think, very difficult to defend. The way the government responded to the crisis right from the beginning was a position of defending the undefensible. Because from now on, the government is bound to defend all the wrongdoings that has taken place within the government, local governments and central government as well. If any revelation about corruptions is regarded as part of foreign or domestic plot. So that is, I think, very dangerous for transparency and accountability in Turkish politics. So as a result, the government reshuffled the police forces. You know, more than 2,000 police officers have been removed from their post. 25 police chiefs of major provinces out of 81 have been removed. In Ankara, overnight, 350 police officers have been removed from their post. Besides, the Minister of Finance, with a department in it fighting against financial crimes, was also subject to government reshuffling. The head of Financial Crimes Investigation Board was removed from his post, and dozens were removed from their posts in the Ministry of Finance. I think more worrying was the attempt of the government to amend judicial policing regulation. They did, in fact, they didn't attempt. They amended judicial policing regulation, compelling the police officers acting under the supervision of public prosecutors to inform their superiors about the investigation that is supposed to be concealed. This was worrisome because it really disabled the judiciary to conduct investigation independent of the government. The next step was the Council of the State, the Supreme Administrative Court in Turkey, overturned this new regulation, finding it against the law and the constitution. Then we encountered a very interesting dialogue between Prime Minister and public prosecutors. Prime Minister, in his public talks, directly addressed and attacked public prosecutors involved in investigation. That was worrisome as well, because for many, that was a clear attempt at influencing justice, obstructing justice. In fact, the High Council of Judges and Public Prosecutors issued a statement then warning the government that these kind of activities went against the Constitution. It was unconstitutional. It went against the independence of the judiciary. In response to the statement of the High Council of Judges and Public Prosecutors, the government came up with a new bill to change the structure and the function of the High Council. Then also there emerged another project of changing the law of the Council of State that overturned overturned by the regulation that the government did on the policing, judicial policing activities. So they all sound strange. They all sound as government was trying to block a judicial process. And that reminds me of an American affair after the Watergate. The Saturday Night Massacre of the prosecutor by President Nixon. Right. Then there was political response. After a week, the government, 4 ministers from the government resigned, but one, Erdogan Bayraktar, while resigning, asked Prime Minister to resign too, because he said what he did was within the knowledge and authorization of Prime Minister. He resigned from his party. Also, he resigned from his post as the Member of Parliament, abandoning his immunities as Member of Parliament. That is very, I think, important. But because it is an important protection in Turkey. If you are prepared to abandon this important immunization, that tells a lot. Anyway, but for government, all these were parts and parcel of plots. So, under normal circumstances, you would expect from a government to be open, transparent, trust in judiciary, and reiterate its fight against corruption. But that didn't happen in Turkey, raising serious concerns about the process and about also the commitment of the government to fight against corruption. What worries me most is the government's resort to conspiracy theories to explain all these events in Turkey. Because, that worries me, because what I see in Turkish history, that whenever governments resorts to conspiracy theories to overcome a crisis or remove the opposition or establish a defense, there comes an authoritarian measures. If you are thinking in terms of conspiracy theories, viewing the world as enemies and friends still as potential enemies in this world of conspiracy theories, then you really abandoned rationality in politics. You attribute everything to external forces. And anyone who opposes you, anyone who comes up with a dissenting voice, appears to you as part of this global conspiracy. So that is, I think, that is problematic in Turkey. These conspiracy theories are paving way for securitization of politics in Turkey. And under this securitization of politics, politics is no longer conceived as normal, lawful political competition, but as a field of war, struggle to death. That is, I think, worrisome. To conclude, what I say is that this crisis highlighted the weaknesses of Turkish democratic system, also institutional system. From now on, if things go on like this, it is going to be extremely difficult for Turkish public to come up and call on governments to be transparent and accountable. Second, it is going to be extremely difficult to find independent public prosecutors to investigate corruption allegations. Very, very difficult. Third, this crisis and the way the government responded to this crisis tells us that political reforms that the government itself has taken for the last 10 years are reversible, They are at the mercy of the government. They are at the mercy of the understanding of the government that those rights or reforms might be damaging or weakening the government itself. So it tells us a mindset that democratic reforms, rule of law, separation of powers are allowed and tolerated to the extent that it perpetuates the authority of the government. When these institutions and values and virtues go against the government, start to enhance the opposition, they cannot be secure. So this reversibility is, I think, very important. I'm just finishing. Fourth, conspiracy theories. Resorting to conspiracy theories tells us a clear inclination on the part of the government towards authoritarianization. A government that resorts to conspiracy theories cannot remain democratic, cannot tolerate dissenting voices and opposition. Then next comes criminalization of opposition, because opposition is regarded as part of an international conspiracy to topple the government. And last, with this crisis, I think Turkey has lost one of its most important assets that we produced in recent years. That is political stability and predictability. This is gone. That's gone. It's not because now AK Party is more vulnerable in upcoming elections. No. AK Party is likely to win again like Nixon won in 1973 after the Watergate scandal. They may win. I mean, AK Party may also win next elections. But the problem is that what we see since Gezi Park protests, the AK Party itself, with its actors, have ceased to be a rational actor. The party and the leader himself have ceased to be a predictable rational actor. That's what I mean. With this, even if AK Party remains in power with growing majority, we do not really know how they will react to particular crises, to what extent they will react within the logic of rationality, within the realm of rationality, and to what extent they will be going beyond rational politics and therefore become unpredictable, leading Turkey with them to the water of political instability. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Question to both of you. Where does President Gül stand here? You don't hear him. It's as if Turkey doesn't even have a president. Can you, Henri, start with you and then...
I think Henri.
Look, it's an interesting question. He actually gave a press interview with 3 journalists last week, on Friday, I believe, in which basically at some point he said, I don't know what I can do. And in a way, the problem is because it's complicated. I mean, Gül, even though he's a president who's above politics by definition, given the title he carries, is nonetheless a product of the AKP and realizes that Erdogan is far too powerful within the party. There's a question of what happens in terms of the presidential election, which is supposed to follow the municipal elections this year. The assumption has been that Erdogan is going to run for the presidency and Gül will step down, and there's a hiatus between the elections in July or August, presidential elections, and the next national elections, in which when Gül can again present himself as a member of parliament in order to become prime minister, etc. So there is all this uncertainty, and I don't think Gül has essentially shown that he's very, very strong as a person anyway. But my guess is that he is essentially biding his time. I think he thinks that this is probably works to his advantage. There's some clearly the way the AKP is going at the moment, given all these conspiracy theories I also you heard from Ihsan, is also creating some dissent within the party. There have been some people who have resigned, not a large number given how many MPs it has. But at some point, Gül must be thinking that as this crisis deepens, people will turn to him in order to save the party, because the situation is going to become unmanageable. And he actually, I've heard this in Ankara, that the joke in Ankara is that Gül talks about the president, the office or the location, Çankaya, as a wailing wall. That people are coming from all walks of life basically saying, please do something, and crying to him. But look, his powers are limited, and I think he's going to wait until things get a lot worse before interjecting himself. At the moment, he's, I think, basically waiting it out. And if he does anything, it's going to take some time.
If his powers are limited, but then he decides he wants to interject, what can he do?
His power is limited, yes, but still he's is entitled to make sure, or his duty is to make sure, as the head of the state, a proper working of institutions of the state. That is his constitutional duty. He is supposed to supervise a proper working of institutions of the state. At the moment, what we see is a kind of state crisis. Executive is confronted by the judiciary is confronted by the executive. So I think there is a clear room for Abdullah Gül to intervene, bring the actors together, take a public stand in favor of the rule of law and the separation of powers. But politically speaking, his ability to influence changes in Turkey is very limited. He still has constitutional power, I think, to bring people together and convince them to cooperate and come to an agreement among various actors. But politically speaking, he's weak. He doesn't have really leverage in Turkish politics. He has lost his touch with the people within the AK Party because for last 5-6 years, the party has become the party of Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan. Gül used to be the second person within the party, but as the president for last 6 years, he has been detached from the party and governmental activity, governmental affairs. So I think his political room is very limited. But to wait to the end and emerge at the end as the savior of the system might be also at risk unless he intervenes at some level at this stage. Because if this confrontation between the judiciary and the government continues, it will be, I think, extremely difficult for president to do something in future to stop the process from deterioration.
We're going to open the floor. Let's start here with Farahnaz Esfahani here, please. And then I have questions from the overflow, so I'll read the questions.
This is just a very quick question to both Professor Baki and Professor Dahi. It's fascinating we're talking about Turkey and neither of you have mentioned the army. With all these crises going on, would there come a time when Abdullah Gül could turn towards the military? Or may there be a nexus between them for some resolution at the rate the things are going at the moment? Thank you.
Henri?
Look, I actually, the fact that we haven't mentioned the army, the fact that in today's conversations, when you talk about Turkey, that the army doesn't really get mentioned is actually one of the good things that has happened in Turkey. That you don't look at the army as a solution, which always was the case. However, there is a dangerous game being played in the sense that the government has been kind of flirting with the army and saying, well, maybe we should revisit all the convictions of the officers, but still nobody, Gül, Erdogan, nobody would want the army to come back in any shape or form, because that's a very, very dangerous step. And I think the army itself has, the army still scores relatively well in public opinion polls, but people do not. I mean, it's very clear that people do not want the army to get involved in politics.
I agree with Henry. I think it's quite true that the army has refrained itself from engaging in this debate, and they've done this, I think, wisely, because nobody really wants to see army meddling in this affair. This is a political struggle to be played out at the political level. Any kind of intervention of the army, statement, taking a position on this affair would damage the political nature of the struggle. Personally, looking at observing the military for the last couple of years and seeing the changes in the mindset of the military officers, I don't expect that military would take a side here and make itself known. But there is also a game, as Henry said, played out by the government to build a new alliance with the ex-military officers in order to balance the allies that the party has lost in recent years.
A question from the overflow. How much what is happening in Turkey can be explained by the conflict between Erdogan and the Gülen movement?
That's a $64,000 question. Look, there's no question. I mean, and this kind of nicely dovetails the issue of the military. I mean, the Gülen movement and the AKP had an alliance, and the alliance was against the military. The one thing they both cared very, very deeply was to essentially, they wanted to push back the military into the barracks. And that happened. I mean, it didn't happen just because they wished it. It didn't happen just because they allied themselves. The military deserves a lot of the blame. They really messed up a lot of things. We don't have time for that here. That said, once you don't have a common enemy anymore, right, and that's where the Gülen movement and the Erdogan folks essentially went their own way. This was never a very easy alliance. I mean, if you go back into the weeds of the Gülen movement and where Gülen movements come from and where the AKP comes from, they come from two very different traditions in Turkish political Islam. And their alliance was tactical, and both now see each other as a threat. The Gülen movement sees Erdogan as becoming too authoritarian, to becoming essentially having created a one-party, one-man rule. And in that sense, it sees Erdogan as a threat to its own well-being, because if Erdogan is that powerful, Erdogan can go after the Gülen movement. Similarly, the government and Erdogan sees this as the Gülen movement as a threat, because supposedly the Gülen movement has infiltrated the state, etc. Look, I do believe perceptions matter. I think there is definitely a fight between the two. But again, I would say that I don't think we can ascribe everything that has happened to the Gülen movement. The Gezi protests clearly had nothing to do with the Gulen movement. I mean, you can't ascribe that. So, the Gezi protests, in many ways, kind of jiggled the system, really, as I said earlier, unhinged the government. And it is possible that some of the prosecutors and some of the police officers are sympathetic to the Gulen movement, but you also have to put into account that prosecutors are prosecutors and police officers are police officers. When they do see corruption, they also they have to do their duty. To say that just because they're Gulenists, they went after cases of corruption, when everybody who works on Turkey knows that there was enormous amount of corruption. I mean, this is because most of the corruption that we're seeing is involved with the construction sector. And because there's been so much construction, I mean, in terms of rent seeking, the oil producing countries have oil, Turkey has now construction. And Istanbul especially is the prize. So there's been an enormous amount of corruption. So everybody's known about this, that the fact that it came out now, it's like, I'm shocked to hear there's corruption going on.
A question for you. Yes, you can. How does the reshuffle in police impact the effectiveness of the police? You can combine both.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just to start with the earlier question, to explain the current crisis with references to a struggle between Erdogan and Gülenists, I think is an oversimplification. It doesn't explain a whole lot of things about Turkish politics. We need to look at the AK Party, its performance, Erdogan, the leader, his changes in his discourse, his style, his approach to politics, his approach to society, economy. There's lots of things to look at in order to explain the current crisis. Yes, Gülenists used to support the AK Party right from the beginning, but it was not only the Gülenists. The liberals, Democrats, many Kurds and Turks supported the AK Party. The European Union, international actors, New York Times, Washington Post, American administration wholeheartedly supported the AK Party too in the past. So, I mean, there are, I think, things to look at in the way the government has started to handle things in the last couple of years, and then turn to the role of the Gülen movement in that. Yes, Gülen movement supported the party, but in recent years, the Gülen movement has problems with the AK Party's foreign policy. They want more moderate foreign policy and less confrontational foreign policy, for instance, like many others. Like me, I've been advocating the Turkish foreign policy has gone too ambitious, too far-reaching, went beyond its capabilities, etc. The Gülen movement wanted a new constitution. They really pressed hard for a new constitution, a new social contract in Turkey. But that wasn't brought about by the government and by other political parties, of course, in the parliament. And they are probably disappointed, like me, like liberals and Democrats in Turkey. So it doesn't really explain much. Gülen movement is a social network, not a political rival, but they are regarded as a rival in Turkish politics by the ruling party. And that is not really something new. The Gülen movement as social network does not really need the support of the government, does not need the resources of the government to survive. It has its own economic resources. It has its own social networking. So they can live independent of the government and government favors. And Turkish state, not only the Republican Turkey, but even the Ottoman Empire never tolerated the emergence of independent, autonomous social forces. They were always concerned about those autonomous social forces who do not need the goodwill and the resources of the state. So as such, the Gülen movement emerged in recent years as the only kind of social movement that could stand on its own and unwilling to submit to the government. Regarding the police, I'm not an expert on security issues, but it's obvious that reshuffling of all those people in police forces would put Turkey in a serious security risks. At the time there is such a big crisis in Syria, at the time we are talking about Al-Qaeda in Syria just bordering Turkey, at the time there are news that lots of weapon trucks with weapons and ships passing through Turkey to Syria. This is a very serious security risk, really.
Henri, do you agree with?
No, I agree. Yeah.
You're okay. Yes, please. And then the back.
Are we perhaps
There's a mic, please. Just please take the mic.
are we perhaps being a little bit too quick to conclude that the military have been eliminated as a factor in this conflict? And I would like to ask you both to comment on the level of the colonels and lieutenant colonels. Most of the arrests and prosecutions that we've heard about are at more senior levels, but has the purge in fact reached down to that lower level? And what do we know about the ideological orientation of the lieutenant colonel, colonel level? After all, we used to think of the military as the stronghold of Kemalism and republicanism. Is that all gone?
It's interesting you raise this issue because a very famous Turkish academic and columnist raised the same issue the other day, saying there's always a possibility of another 27th of May coup, which was done by junior officers in 1960. But look, any attempt by the military to intercede, I can predict one thing. Gülen and Erdogan will forget the fight and coalesce again against the military. I mean, that, if you want to bring those two guys together, you raise the specter of the military. Look, I'm being flip, but there's a way in which I think the military is out. I'm sure there are officers who would like to coup, who are maybe even contemplating a coup, but I don't think there is societal support for that at this stage. Now, if you had a real civil war in Turkey at some point again, maybe, but not at the moment.
Yes, gentleman in the back. Sure. Yes, you.
Some women too.
And then you can answer that.
Hi. My question is, while all of this has been happening, another important development has been going on, which is KRG exports of oil to Turkey through pipelines. It's a pretty big deal in the last month. Is there any relationship between, or is there any impact between these two developments?
Let's take another question too. Yes, the lady with the red scarf, and then you can answer the two questions.
There's a Persian proverb that says, "You took us to the bank of the river and brought us back thirsty." Ihsan Bey, and the reason is because you were talking about a change in the discourse of Erdogan and the change of in his reactions, and I'm wondering, did you really mean to say that there is an old Erdogan and a new Erdogan? So I have always felt that he could not have been as popular as he became if he had done this kind of thing throughout his history. So first question, do you think that there's a change in Erdogan, and when and how did it change? When did it change?
Okay.
Yeah, that's very hard question really to answer,
But
because
you have very little
yes,
time.
yeah, but we see, I mean, the AK Party and Erdogan came from an Islamist background, and they came up denouncing their Islamist credentials, in fact, claiming to be at the center, abandoning Islamic political projects, and adapted this language of democracy, human rights, rule of law, membership in the European Union, welcoming international financial resources, etc. And with that, they made really 34%, 47%. So democracy, rule of law, human rights were the key, I think, concepts and aspirations of Turkish people that they voted for the AK Party. But these were also useful, handy, to fight against the military tutelage in Turkey and the power of the Kemalist secularism within the state, because that required democratization, that required international cooperation. But once that structure has been eliminated, symbolized by 2010 constitutional referendum, then the party and Erdogan, I think, thought that they had now free hand. They don't need to champion those lofty ideas of democracy and human rights. And also, from then on, having the apparatus of the state, coercive apparatus of the state, and also co-optational capacity of the state were in their hands, and instead of appealing the masses with democratic discourse, I think the party and Erdogan moved to use coercion and co-optation, and at the same time fear, by resorting to conspiracy theories to keep its social base. That's what I see.
Yeah. Henri, you have the final word on everything.
On everything.
On everything. All the questions, yeah.
Let me start with the KRG question and the oil
Yeah.
export. No, I don't really think it's going to impact. There's a logic to oil exports from the KRG through Turkey. I think the Maliki government has also made its peace with that notion, and therefore this is not going to be affected by the crisis in the immediate future. Look, what I was trying to say earlier in my comments, and I'll hook it up to what Ihsan just said in terms of discourse. We are really in uncharted waters at the moment. There's a logic to this kind of conspiracy-minded mindset, these accusations, the vehemence with which people are accusing each other, which is not very healthy. And in the absence of a constitutional change, I mean, Turkey was supposed to have real, serious constitutional change. The 1982 constitution was supposed to be replaced by a constitution that was going to be liberal, citizen-friendly, instead of being state-friendly. Erdogan didn't do that because he kept essentially the constitutional change hostage to his own ambitions. And his own ambitions was that he wanted to become president of Turkey in a different system, which would be a presidential system where powers would be essentially rested with the president and not with parliament and the prime minister. But he didn't succeed that. But he played this. I mean, he played this in this desire, his own desire to his own ambitions, and the constitution became a victim of that. And in the absence of serious institutions, this is why you can see why they can move around, overnight 300 police officers. They can change things that they changed only 2 years ago. And it has become an amazingly personalistic system. And the question that you raise is it the same Erdogan? Maybe it is the same Erdogan, except that he was, as a lot of people are saying today, that he was dissimulating at the time. Right? I don't believe this. I think what happened is that with time, success after success, I mean, he won 3 elections, every time increasing his share of the vote. Has never happened since the 1950s. Complete homage by every person around him who keep always telling him that he's doing great, that he is above, he is essentially a new sultan, a new prophet, a new whatever. I mean, let me just read you what one member of parliament from his party said the other day, talking about all this support for Erdogan. He says, if it is homage or complete obedience to Erdogan, so be it. We stand behind him to our death. Now, this is not exactly the kind of discourse you expect. But to me, the worrisome thing is I had a conversation in the summer after the Gezi protests with one of the leading members of the party, one of the guys who was supposed to take over from Erdogan when Erdogan became president, not good. And this guy is an economist. I was struck by the vehemence and the clarity with which he tried to explain that how the Gezi protest was a construct by the international interest rate lobby. Now, I tried to put myself in his shoes, and I said to myself, okay, if somebody tells me to express these thoughts, I would not be able to do the job he did, which was an amazing job, right? Because if you don't believe in it, you would not be able to be coherent, you'd not be able to be consistent, etc. This guy he had charts, he had arguments, everything you pushed back at him, he came back with numbers, and you realize at the end is that he really believes it. And that to me is what's so scary about what's going on in Turkey. That when you watch people talk in the, the stuff you have the crass stuff. I just found out last week, that in case you don't know, I should tell you this. Lincoln was assassinated by Jews, as was Kennedy. And that this Federal Reserve is essentially controlled by 7 Jewish families.
9/11 was done by Jews.
But the way, it's hard to sometimes when you watch this stuff, the ease with which this stuff is being said and assumed to be true. And then you ask yourself, where is the rationality here? Why isn't anybody asking and questioning themselves? Is it true what I'm saying? So to me, that's the worst part of this. Look, conspiracy theories in the Middle East, we've all lived with it. We all know they existed. But that they exist at such a high level, right? So ask yourself now, next time, if Obama is to meet Erdogan in some conclave, the G20 or something like that, so Obama is going to say, this guy actually thinks maybe Lufthansa did the Gezi protest, or I was responsible for this, that I'm trying to overthrow him. So what kind of relationship do you have with somebody who actually is not very rational? Now, it may be that Erdogan is the only one who's rational here, that he actually doesn't believe any of this nonsense, but he is actually doing this because, as I said earlier, he has a goal, and he needs to get 47% of the vote in the municipal elections. Après moi le déluge. That's the most important thing for him to achieve, and that's what he wants to do. But to me, the worrying part is what also Ihsan said, that this brings about an authoritarianization of the society once again. And it is happening because they never changed the constitution. They never really created a constitution that is, shall we say, idiot-proof in terms of people being able to play with it. And so we're in for a very, very rough ride. I think this is the beginning of a very nasty story. If things don't go well, expect Erdogan to come up with another bombastic, maybe start prosecuting people for terrorism charges, for bringing up the corruption case. But I do also want to say one final thing. The reason I also don't think this is going to end is because put yourself in the shoes of police officers who are seeing their colleagues being bandied about, thrown from one location to another. There was a case where police officers had been reassigned to Izmir. Within 5 days, they realized that, these guys are not really very trustworthy, so they got reassigned again to some other location. I think you're going to see much more fighting between institutions because other police officers are going to be, even if they haven't been relocated, are going to be angry. They're going to get their hands on information and pass it to sympathetic press organizations. And this is only the beginning. Hold on tight.
Thank you very much. Let me thank our 2 speakers on behalf of the Global Europe program and the Middle East program. and because both of them told us that this is just the beginning of a rough time, the beginning of a crisis, so we will invite them back.
That's why
very
we said this,
soon
actually.
to come to the center. Please join me in thanking them. Thank you very much. Thank you.